The room was dark, save for the faint glow of a bedside lamp. Outside, the London night pressed close against the windows, rain streaking the glass like blurred ink on a forgotten letter. It was the 29th of August, 1982, her birthday, and her last night alive. 67 years had carried her from the cobbled streets of Stockholm to the roaring boulevards of Hollywood, and yet, at this final moment, she was still a woman alone with her body and its betrayal. Cancer had ravaged her, hollowed her frame, yet her face so famous, so endlessly studied, still carried the ghost of the light that once silenced entire theaters. The clock ticked past midnight. Its sound seemed louder than it should have been, as if the walls themselves wished to mark the passing of each second. Time was Ingrid Bergman's final companion, patient and merciless. The irony that she should die on her birthday was not lost on those closest to her. A circle completed. One of her friends would later whisper, half in awe, half in fear of what it might mean. In myth and poetry, a birth and death entwined on the same day is fate's cruel joke. A reminder that life is less a line than a loop, one that inevitably closes. Her bed was covered not with the glamorous fabrics of film sets, but with hospital sheets softened by years of washing. The actress who had once worn gowns shimmering under studio lights now wore only the pallor of illness. Yet there was a stillness to her, a queenly composure, as if even death itself were something she was rehearsing. The rain outside quickened, tapping at the glass like an audience waiting for the curtain to rise. Somewhere in the house, a phone rested in silence. No late calls came. The world had long known her struggle with breast cancer. It had followed her surgeries, her remissions, her reappearances on stage, and the inexorable return of the disease. But that night, the phone stayed quiet. Silence was its own omen, pressing into the walls, into the pulse of the house, into her final breaths. Those who were there later described her last hours with a kind of reverence. She was not afraid, they said, but resigned. Yet, resignation has its own drama. It is not the absence of fear, but the acknowledgement that fear has no further purpose. Ingrid had lived her life in front of cameras, but death would be a private performance, unlit, unfilmed, known only to those in the room and to the rain whispering at her window. Her death at 67 was not unexpected, yet the manner of it, the birthday, the circular symmetry invited myth. Was it mere coincidence, or some dark orchestration of fate? Philosophers might say, it speaks to the unity of beginnings and endings, that the day that opens one's life might also close it, as if destiny wished to bind her existence into a single sealed volume. Others saw it as crueler, a mockery of celebration, replacing cake and candles with mourning and silence. Ingrid Bergman's passing left not just an absence, but an echo. Friends recalled the way she spoke of time in her last years, as if it were a lover who could not be trusted. "It slips," she once murmured to a confidant, "even as you hold it in your hands." Perhaps that is why the ticking of the clock in her final room felt so sharp, so insistent it was time's last word, closing the dialogue. And so, on the night of her 67th birthday, the woman whose face had been called immortal left her mortal body. Outside, the rain finally slowed, and the first light of dawn began to gray the sky. London woke to an ordinary morning, unaware that one of cinema's brightest constellations had just been extinguished. In that quiet house, the curtain had fallen. The story of Ingrid Bergman begins not on a stage or in the shimmer of studio lights, but in the muted tones of Northern Europe, where winters pressed heavy and silence often felt like its own presence. She was born on the 29th of August, 1915, in Stockholm, Sweden, to a family that carried both warmth and fragility. Her mother, Friedel, was gone by the time Ingrid was 2 years old, claimed by illness before her daughter could fully form memories of her face or her voice. What remained were only impressions, a soft presence she could not recall, and a void she would never stop feeling. Her father, Justice, was a man of quiet affection, an amateur photographer who filled his home with portraits images of his beloved wife, of his young daughter, of a life that seemed at once fragile and sacred. For Ingrid, the camera was not merely a tool of documentation, it was a talisman, something that captured memory against the cruelty of time. She would spend hours with him in his studio, gazing into mirrors and lenses, learning without realizing it the strange alchemy of performance. The photographs he took of her are haunting now. A girl with wide, solemn eyes, always gazing slightly past the frame, as though she already knew life would demand more of her than childhood should. When she was 13, death came again. Her father collapsed from illness and never rose. Ingrid was left alone in the world, shuttled to relatives who offered her care but never the intimacy she had known. The photographs he had taken of her became her inheritance, her only dialogue with the parent who had taught her to see herself as a subject worth capturing. Mirrors and images became motifs of her life, a face that could be multiplied infinitely, yet never returned the gaze of the one she longed for most. The silence of her teenage years is difficult to fathom. She was not yet famous, not yet the woman whose name would dominate marquees, but already she carried the aura of someone set apart. Loss has a way of shaping presence. It can make a person quieter, more observant, as though listening for echoes the rest of the world ignores. Ingrid seemed to listen to life that way. At school, she was tall, awkward, with a seriousness that others mistook for pride, but those who looked closer saw something more fragile, a girl who had already been forced to bury her childhood alongside her parents. In those years, she discovered the stage, not as escape, but as a mirror of her own emptiness. Acting was not for applause, it was communion, a way to inhabit emotions too heavy to name. When she spoke lines written by others, the silence inside her seemed to dissolve for a time. For an orphan, theater became a substitute family, a place where words and gestures could replace all the conversations that had been lost to death. And yet, one cannot help but see the eerie symmetry of her beginnings. A girl raised by images, haunted by absences, destined to become the most filmed face of her century. The camera had taken her father from her, his obsession with photographs, a quiet inheritance, and then it gave her back to the world, magnified beyond what she could have imagined. Fate seemed to toy with her even then, binding her to both the gift and curse of being watched. There is a philosophy that suggests our earliest losses shape the roles we are drawn to play. For Ingrid, this seems inescapable. She would spend her career portraying women torn between love and duty, between passion and restraint, between belonging and exile. Perhaps it was because, even in her private life, those were the only roles she had ever known. In Stockholm, under the dim northern light, the child of shadows and light was becoming something else. An actress, yes, but also a vessel for memory itself. She had no parents to guide her, only photographs and echoes. Yet out of that silence, she began to build a voice the world would one day hear. The world did not discover Ingrid Bergman all at once. She emerged gradually, as though destiny itself preferred to reveal her in stages. After finishing her studies, she entered the Royal Dramatic Theatre School in Stockholm, the same institution that had trained Greta Garbo before her. The parallels would not be lost on anyone. Two Swedish women, tall and enigmatic, destined to be icons. But while Garbo cultivated mystery and distance, Ingrid radiated something different: openness, a guileless transparency that seemed almost unguarded. On stage, she carried herself like someone caught between two worlds, the discipline of her craft, and the emotional depth that seemed to spill out of her no matter the role. The teachers noticed, audiences noticed, and soon, the camera noticed as well. In 1935, she made her film debut in a small role, a mere flicker on screen. Yet even in those brief moments, her face carried something magnetic, a quiet insistence that the lens could not look away. Swedish cinema gave her a handful of early roles, but one film changed everything. Intermezzo, 1936. She played a young pianist who falls into a doomed romance with a married violinist. The story itself was not new, but the way she played it was. The vulnerability, the trembling sincerity, the way her emotions seemed to surface through the smallest shifts of her gaze. This was not performance as artifice, but performance as revelation. When audiences watched her, they felt they were trespassing on something private, something almost too real to belong to fiction. The motif of music echoed deeply in her early career. Pianos, violins, melodies half resolved, always suggesting both harmony and discord. In Intermezzo, the music bound the lovers together, but also reminded them of the inevitability of their separation. For Ingrid, who had already lived through the loss of both parents, the role must have carried a private resonance. Love, in her world, was never permanent. Beauty was always fragile, poised to vanish like a lingering note. It was this film that caught the attention of Hollywood producer David O. Selznick. He saw in Ingrid something he believed America had not yet experienced. An actress whose beauty was not manufactured but natural, whose talent seemed unstudied, almost instinctive. When he brought her to Hollywood to remake Intermezzo in English, Ingrid stepped into a world both dazzling and treacherous. Hollywood was not Stockholm. The climate itself was different. The constant glare of the California sun, the relentless brightness that left no room for shadows. In that light, every imperfection could be seen. Yet Ingrid was not undone by it. She resisted the sculpting hand of the studio system. She refused to pluck her eyebrows into thin arcs, refused to change her teeth, refused to adopt the sharp mannerisms expected of a starlet. "If I have to change everything," she once told Selznick, "then I am not Ingrid Bergman anymore." That refusal became part of her myth. Audiences responded not just to her roles, but to the sense that what they saw was unfiltered, that she was somehow closer to truth than the carefully managed stars around her. The camera, which so easily betrayed artifice, seemed to conspire with her instead. When she looked into the lens, it was as though she was looking through it, at the audience directly, stripping them of their defenses. But the ascent into stardom carried its own shadows. Hollywood adored her, but also began to claim her. She was no longer the orphaned girl of Stockholm, nor the earnest student of the Royal Dramatic Theatre. She was property, a symbol, a face that could sell tickets across the globe. Fame, like the lens of her father's camera, captured her, magnified her, but never returned her gaze. There is something almost tragic in the inevitability of it. A girl raised on photographs becomes the most photographed woman of her generation. A child of absence becomes the embodiment of presence. The very face that had once stared out from her father's pictures now belonged to the world, glowing on billboards, frozen in stills, immortalized yet increasingly beyond her own control. And so, Ingrid Bergman was made into a star. Yet even in those early days of Hollywood, when she seemed unstoppable, the seeds of contradiction were already there. For behind every perfect frame of her face, behind every carefully orchestrated performance, lingered a question that would never leave her. What does it mean to be truly seen? The year was 1942, and the world was in flames. Europe lay shattered beneath the weight of war, and across the ocean, Hollywood was becoming something more than entertainment. It was a weapon of morale, a cathedral of moving images meant to keep despair at bay. And into this crucible came Ingrid Bergman, cast in the role that would define her forever, Ilsa Lund in Casablanca. The set itself was modest. Smoke curled through the studio, not from cigarettes alone, but from machines designed to blur edges, to soften reality. Shadows hung heavy against walls painted to resemble Moroccan alleys. At the center of it all, Ingrid stood beneath the lights, her eyes shimmering with that peculiar mixture of clarity and mystery that no cinematographer could fully explain. Beside her was Humphrey Bogart, already hardened into legend, his voice rasping through lines that would echo for decades. The camera loved her in Casablanca with a devotion bordering on obsession. Every close-up became a portrait, every glance layered with meaning. She embodied longing itself, love restrained, desire denied, memory turned into wound. To watch her in those frames was to feel not only the story of Ilsa, but something deeper. The echo of her own losses, her own knowledge of absence. There is a moment in the film when she turns her gaze away, tears barely forming, her face half lit as if by memory itself. That moment became cinema's mirror for longing. Audiences around the world saw their own heartbreaks reflected in her. Soldiers carried photographs of Ingrid Bergman in their pockets as they went into battle, believing her to be the image of everything worth returning to. In war, she was not just an actress. She was a promise that beauty, tenderness, and sorrow might still survive. But what few saw was that Ingrid herself was already beginning to wrestle with contradictions. The Hollywood star machine demanded perfection, an illusion of grace without fracture. Yet Ingrid was restless. She wanted roles that carried weight, that challenged her. Even in Casablanca, she asked director Michael Curtiz whether Ilsa truly loved Rick or her husband Victor. Curtiz told her not to decide, play it both ways. And so she did. Her ambiguity gave the film its enduring mystery. But for Ingrid, it was a symbol of her life. Never one truth, always two, always torn between. Mirrors haunted her during those years. Dressing rooms lined with reflective glass showed her multiplied endlessly. The same face looking back from different angles, each slightly altered by shadow and light. Which one was real? The ingenue from Stockholm, the devoted mother and wife, or the immortal Ilsa etched into the minds of millions? Fame fragmented her, as surely as war fragmented the world outside the studio walls. There was also an irony. While Ingrid was becoming the emblem of fidelity and sacrifice on screen, her private life was less serene. Her marriage to Petter Lindström, a Swedish neurosurgeon, was already strained by distance and ambition. Hollywood had given her everything: wealth, fame, immortality, but it also pulled her further from the domestic life she was expected to maintain. The public saw Ilsa, torn between two men, as a tragic heroine. Ingrid, off-screen, began to feel the same dissonance in her own heart. Philosophers have long said that cinema is both a mirror and a mask. For Ingrid, Casablanca was both. It reflected her essence, the sorrow of loss, the tenderness of longing, and it also masked her contradictions, hiding them behind the safety of fiction. The war ended, but the image of Ingrid Bergman as the eternal Ilsa remained. She had become more than an actress. She was now an idea, an icon, an emblem of love caught between duty and desire. And yet, icons cannot remain untouched forever. By the late 1942nd, Ingrid would shatter her own image in ways that would scandalize the world. But in 1942, as Casablanca spread across continents, she was untouchable. A single face, framed by smoke and shadow, carrying the weight of a broken world's longing. Still, even in those luminous close-ups, one can almost sense it. The faint tremor of unease, as though she already knew that no role, no image, no film could contain the contradictions of her life. By the late 1942nd, Ingrid Bergman stood at the peak of her fame. She had become Hollywood's saintly figure, an actress who seemed to embody purity, sincerity, and grace. Her face was synonymous with integrity. Audiences trusted her in a way that transcended performance. To millions, she was not just a star, but a moral compass, the woman whose luminous presence seemed untouched by scandal in an industry built on shadows. And then, in 1949, she did the unthinkable. It began with a letter. Ingrid, restless with the limitations of Hollywood, had been enthralled by the work of Italian filmmaker Roberto Rossellini. His films, raw and unpolished, bore little resemblance to the glitter of the American studio system. They carried the grit of real life, the smell of streets and kitchens, the weight of unvarnished truth. She wrote to him, offering herself not as a star, but as a woman who wanted to act in his world. The letter was a quiet rebellion, a refusal of the polished artifice that had both made and imprisoned her. Rossellini accepted. And when Ingrid traveled to Italy to make Stromboli with him, something irreversible occurred. The affair that followed was not merely a personal choice, but a cultural earthquake. She was married, a mother, and so was he. The news exploded across headlines. Ingrid Bergman, the saint of the silver screen, had abandoned her husband and daughter for a foreign director. The scandal consumed her. In America, senators denounced her from the floor of Congress. One famously declared that Ingrid Bergman was a powerful influence for evil. Letters poured in, some filled with rage, others with heartbreak. The public who had once carried her face into war now felt betrayed. Hollywood, that most merciless of kingdoms, closed its doors. Ingrid herself seemed both destroyed and liberated. For the first time, she was no longer playing a role for the public, but choosing one for herself. Rossellini's films were not glamorous. Stromboli, with its volcanic landscapes and spare dialogue, was a study in isolation and survival. Ingrid's performance as a desperate woman trapped on a barren island mirrored her own exile. She had left behind a world that adored her and entered one that scrutinized her with disdain. The motif of exile would cling to her life from this point onward. In Rome, she lived as both pariah and pioneer. She bore 3 children with Rossellini twins Isabella and Isotta, and their son, Roberto. But while she built a new family, she lost another. Her daughter, Pia, from her first marriage, remained in America with her father, and the separation haunted Ingrid for years. The mirrors that once multiplied her image in Hollywood dressing rooms now reflected her contradictions more sharply than ever. She was mother and exile, saint and sinner, adored and reviled. The films she made with Rossellini baffled critics who had loved her in Casablanca and Gaslight. They were too raw, too unpolished, too close to the bone. Yet beneath their rough edges, they captured something that Hollywood had never dared to show. The vulnerability of a woman stripped of artifice, surviving in landscapes as hostile as public opinion. Ingrid's scandal was not just personal, it was mythic. For centuries, women who transgressed, who claimed desire and freedom beyond the boundaries of convention, were punished, exiled, cast out. Ingrid was no different, except that her punishment was broadcast across nations. The world could not forgive its saint for being human, and yet, in retrospect, there is something hauntingly necessary about her rebellion. To betray an image is sometimes the only way to remain true to oneself. Ingrid Bergman, the woman who had lived her life between mirrors and lenses, chose at last to shatter them. And though the world would recoil, the fragments of her image shattered, scattered, carried a strange new beauty, sharp with truth. Still, the cost was immense. Hollywood exiled her. America turned away. And for nearly a decade, Ingrid lived in the shadow of her own scandal. Her brilliance dimmed. Her name, a whisper of betrayal. The irony was brutal. The woman who once symbolized purity was now marked with disgrace. Yet exile would not be her ending. It would, instead, prepare her for the strange resurrection to come. Exile has its own geography. For Ingrid Bergman, it was the Rome of Rossellini, a city where ruins stood side by side with new beginnings. The cobblestone streets, the flicker of candles in cavernous churches, the smell of roasted chestnuts on corners, all of it became the texture of her new life. Yet beneath the color and vitality of Italy, there was a darker truth. She was living as an outcast in the eyes of the world that once worshipped her. The Rossellini years were complex, both intoxicating and suffocating. Together, Ingrid and Roberto sought to reinvent cinema. They produced films that blurred the line between fiction and reality, art and life. Europe, 2051. Journey to Italy. Fear these were not Hollywood spectacles, but raw meditations on grief, alienation, and dislocation. The critics at the time often dismissed them as failures, yet later generations would call them masterpieces, seeds of the modern art film. But if her career in Rome was a crucible for artistic freedom, her private life was less forgiving. Rossellini, brilliant but tempestuous, often treated Ingrid with the same harshness he brought to his filmmaking. Their marriage was stormy, riddled with quarrels, infidelities, and the grinding weight of daily life far removed from the shimmering illusions of Hollywood. Ingrid, once untouchable on American screens, now walked markets with a basket on her arm, pushing prams, managing a household. To the paparazzi, she was both spectacle and scandal, a woman who had traded the crown of Hollywood for domestic chaos, and yet, the motif of duality persisted. On screen, she embodied exile, women cut off from home, struggling to reconcile their inner lives with harsh landscapes. Off-screen, she lived that reality. Mother of twins, absent mother to Pia, wife to a mercurial genius, but also a woman still yearning for the stage, for the work that defined her very being. The tide began to turn in the mid-1952nd. European critics started to recognize the boldness of Rossellini's films, and whispers of rehabilitation reached across the Atlantic. Then, in 1956, Ingrid's life shifted once more. She was cast in Anastasia, the story of a woman believed to be the surviving daughter of Russia's last Tsar, living in exile, doubted by all, struggling to reclaim her name. The role was uncanny in its parallels to Ingrid herself. When Anastasia premiered, audiences were stunned. The very woman they had condemned for scandal now returned to them through the story of another exile, another doubted figure. Her performance was luminous, layered with the pain of someone who knew too well what it meant to be cast out. The Academy responded. Ingrid Bergman, once denounced as a powerful influence for evil, won the Oscar for Best Actress. She did not attend the ceremony in person. Instead, Cary Grant accepted the award on her behalf, his voice steady as he spoke her name. For America, it was a moment of reluctant reconciliation. For Ingrid, it was proof that even after betrayal, exile, and condemnation, she could still rise, phoenix-like, from ashes. Her return to American screens was not a surrender but a reclamation. The saintly image of the 1942nd was gone forever. What remained was something more complex, more human. A woman marked by contradiction, by choices both celebrated and condemned, by a face that now carried not just beauty, but history. Yet the scars of exile did not vanish. Pia, her daughter from her first marriage, had grown up largely without her mother. Ingrid's other children bore the weight of a public life that was never entirely theirs. Her marriage with Rossellini unraveled, ending in divorce. Success in Hollywood was reclaimed, but at the cost of wounds that no award could heal. And so, Ingrid Bergman re-emerged victorious. Yes, but changed. She had returned to acclaim, but she had also returned with shadows intact, as though the scandal had fused itself permanently into her legend. Exile and return, a cycle as old as myth. For Ingrid, it was not a single chapter, but the pattern of her life always cast out, always coming back, always marked by the contradictions that made her more than a star, more than an image. She had become a figure of survival, and yet, even survival cannot outpace time. The next act of her story would not be scandal or exile, but the slow encroachment of something far more inevitable: illness. Fame, for all its radiance, leaves behind shadows most visible within the family home. For Ingrid Bergman, the roles she played off-screen as wife, mother, exile, and icon were rarely in harmony. The contradictions of her life bled into her relationships with her children, each of them carrying memories of a mother both fiercely present and hauntingly absent. Her daughter Pia, from her first marriage to Petter Lindstrom, bore perhaps the deepest wound. When Ingrid left for Italy with Roberto Rossellini, Pia remained in America with her father. To the world, Ingrid was making daring choices in the name of love and art. To Pia, she was simply gone. Letters traveled across oceans, but they could not replace the warmth of a mother's hand, the steady presence of her voice at bedtime. Years later, Pia would speak openly of her mother's absence, describing it not with bitterness alone, but with the ache of someone who had lived in the echo of a love half withheld. In Rome, life was no less complex. The 3 children she bore with Rossellini twin daughters, Isabella and Isotta, and their son Roberto, grew up surrounded by both tenderness and turbulence. Ingrid adored them, and in photographs from those years, she can be seen holding them close, her luminous face bent down toward theirs in expressions of pure devotion. Yet her devotion was divided. Film sets claimed her, rehearsals absorbed her, and her restless spirit, hungry for challenge, for reinvention, often pulled her away. The children remembered her as passionate, warm, and playful, yet also as someone who could vanish for long stretches, swallowed by the demands of cinema. Isabella Rossellini, who would later step into the world of film and modeling herself, once reflected that her mother was like a comet, brilliant, unforgettable, but never fully possessed. She was ours, Isabella recalled, but she also belonged to the world. The motif of absence persisted in her life like a recurring chord. Mirrors, once symbols of her fractured self-image, now seemed to reflect the gap between her public and private selves. To audiences, she was seamless, whole. To her children, she was a figure glimpsed in fragments, sometimes radiant, sometimes unreachable, and yet, to reduce Ingrid to absence alone would be unfair. When she was with her children, she was wholly present. She told stories in animated voices, cooked simple meals, laughed loudly at their mischief. She taught them to embrace contradiction, to see beauty not in perfection but in the act of living fully, even imperfectly. The very turbulence of her life became, paradoxically, its own form of lesson. That love is not always tidy, and that devotion can coexist with distance. Still, the scars remained. Pia, for years estranged from her mother, reconciled with her only later, after time had softened their grievances. Isabella and Isotta would defend Ingrid fiercely, understanding the complexity of her life, even when it left them longing for more of her presence. In interviews decades later, they spoke of her not as an untouchable icon, but as a woman caught between impossible roles, one who loved deeply but never quite managed to be everywhere at once. It is here that the deeper philosophical question emerges. Can anyone belong fully to both art and family? The camera demands devotion, audiences demand presence, and children demand the same. To give wholly to one is to wound the other. Ingrid's life was a study in that impossible balance, a reminder that even those who seem larger than life cannot escape the limitations of time and flesh. The house in Rome bore witness to it all. Laughter echoing in one room, arguments in another, cameras waiting outside in the street. Her life was never private, never her own. And yet, within that chaos, there were moments fleeting, fragile, where her children felt her love with absolute certainty. Ingrid Bergman was, above all, human. And perhaps it was her humanity, raw and contradictory, that made her performances so devastatingly real. She did not act longing, she lived it. She did not play absence, she carried it. She did not perform exile, she embodied it. The stage and screen gave her immortality, but for her children, immortality was no consolation. They remembered her instead as a mother, whose love was undeniable, but scattered like light through a prism, refracted, beautiful, but never whole. Illness entered Ingrid Bergman's life quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow crossing a sunlit room. At first, it was nothing more than a lump, a diagnosis spoken in a tone she tried to dismiss. But breast cancer, once it takes root, carries with it a silence more menacing than any scandal, more relentless than any exile. It became her hidden adversary, a private antagonist that would accompany her through her final decade. She confronted it as she had confronted much of her life, with a strange mixture of dignity and defiance. Surgeons cut into her body, removing what they could, altering forever the physical form that had once been adored by millions. And yet, she refused to vanish. The face remained luminous, the eyes unyielding. She returned to the stage, to the screen, even as her body carried the scars. There was a cruel irony to it all. Ingrid Bergman, the woman whose life had been defined by presence, by the radiance of her image, by the visibility of her fame, now found herself waging war against something invisible, something hidden deep inside. Cancer, unlike scandal, left no headlines. It was a battle waged in silence, behind doors, in rooms where the only witnesses were doctors and loved ones. And still, she acted. In 1978, already weakened, she portrayed Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir in the television film A Woman Called Golda. It was a role unlike any she had played before, aged, stern, commanding. She wore wigs to cover her hair loss, prosthetics to reshape her face. But beneath the artifice, there was truth. Viewers who watched her saw not just Golda Meir, but a woman fighting against the betrayal of her own body, summoning strength from a place deeper than art. The performance won her both an Emmy and a Golden Globe. And yet it was not triumph alone, it was defiance, a refusal to let illness dictate her final act. Clocks became a motif in her later years. She spoke of time not as a concept, but as a presence. "You don't really own it," she once said. "You borrow it." Perhaps that was why, even in pain, she kept working. Each role, each performance, was a way of borrowing a little more time, of leaving behind fragments of herself that illness could not erase. Friends recalled her humor, even in the shadow of disease. When told she might slow down, she replied, "If I rest, I'll rust." There was a fire in her still, though it burned lower, with embers rather than flames. She traveled less, saw fewer crowds, but her will was unbroken. Her children, by now grown, became her companions in the battle, nursing her, laughing with her, carrying with them the same contradictions of love and loss that had always defined their bond. Cancer is relentless in its patience. It waits, it returns, it reminds. And for Ingrid, it became the final exile, not from nations or audiences, but from her own body. The woman who had been larger than life found herself reduced, physically diminished, yet spiritually magnified. There was something profoundly symbolic in the way illness shaped her last roles. Where once she played women defined by beauty and longing, now she embodied resilience, leadership, and the quiet authority of survival. It was as though her career had come full circle, mirroring her own passage from luminous ingenue to weathered fighter, from saint of the screen to mortal woman facing time itself. The rain that had so often been her motif in films returned too, in her private reflections. She spoke of how storms reminded her of her childhood in Stockholm, of gray skies pressing down, of the fragility of warmth. "When it rains," she said in an interview, "you remember that nothing lasts forever, not fame, not beauty, not even pain." Her illness did not diminish her legend. If anything, it burnished it. The photographs of her in these years show a woman no longer flawless, but fierce. The symmetry of her face had softened, the lines deepened, but the gaze remained. Always that gaze direct, unflinching, as if to remind the world that she was not just an image, but a life, lived fully, even in suffering. On the 29th of August, 1982. Ingrid Bergman's life completed its strange, symmetrical circle. She was born on that day in 1915. 67 years later, she died on the same date, as though fate itself insisted that her beginning and end be bound by one calendar page. To some, it felt cruel. To others, it was poetic life folding into itself, closing its loop. Her final hours unfolded in her London home, quiet and shadowed, the rain streaking across the windows like veils of memory. She had fought cancer for nearly a decade. Her body weakened, her energy diminished, yet her mind remained luminous. Her children gathered, speaking in hushed tones, listening to the shallow rhythm of her breath. A lamp glowed beside her bed. The room carried a silence that was not emptiness but presence, the kind of silence that feels like a witness. The motif of the clock returned once more. As the hours passed, each tick seemed louder, marking the narrowing distance between life and death. Time, which had both crowned her and betrayed her, was counting down. Those who loved her later said there was no fear in her eyes, only resignation. A woman who had lived through scandal, exile, fame, and illness understood that endings were simply part of the design. And yet, the fact of her birthday lingered like a riddle. To die on the day one is born, what meaning could that hold? Was it coincidence, a cosmic accident, or some dark choreography of fate? Philosophers have written that to be born and to die on the same date is to live a complete circle, to embody the totality of existence within a single frame. For others, it is cruel irony, a reminder that life often mocks our desire for neatness and meaning. Ingrid's death carried both readings. For her children, it was cruel the day meant for candles, and laughter turned into mourning. For admirers, it was haunting, almost mythic. The star who once belonged to the world was extinguished on the very day she had entered it, as though destiny refused to allow even her departure to be ordinary. Her funeral was small, held in London, attended by family, friends, and a few of the luminaries who had walked beside her through cinema's golden age. Isabella Rossellini recalled the strangeness of the day, the mingling of sorrow with awe, grief with reverence. Mourners spoke of her as though she were not merely a woman but an emblem, a face, a voice, a presence that transcended death itself. Outside, the late summer air carried the faint chill of approaching autumn. The rain had ceased, and the streets glistened as though washed for ceremony. It was not difficult to imagine her spirit somewhere in that gray light, as if the world itself had chosen to pause, to hold its breath, to acknowledge the closing of her circle. The coincidence of her birthday death has never ceased to fascinate biographers, fans, and philosophers alike. For some, it represents the purity of completion, birth and death on the same date, the book of life neatly opened and closed. For others, it underscores the cruelty of fate that even in her final hours, Ingrid Bergman was denied the luxury of an ordinary ending. Perhaps it is this haunting symmetry that has kept her memory alive with such force. To speak of Ingrid Bergman is to speak not only of luminous roles, scandals, and triumphs, but also of mystery, the mystery of a life that seemed fated, scripted by forces beyond her control, as if her existence were itself a film written by an unseen director. When the last breath left her body, the world lost not just an actress, but a paradox. A woman who was at once saint and exile, mother and absence, immortal image, and fragile flesh. The curtain fell, the light dimmed. Yet even in death, Ingrid Bergman seemed to belong not to silence, but to story. And the story, as always, was not finished. Her death did not erase her. It never could. In many ways, Ingrid Bergman's true immortality began after her body was gone, when her face, timeless, luminous, unmarked by illness, in the memories of audiences remained frozen in reels of film and photographs. To this day, her eyes in Casablanca still shine as though the camera caught not light but eternity. The question that lingers is not who she was, but how she could be so many things at once and yet remain unknowable. Her image, endlessly reproduced, has become a motif in itself. Posters, magazine covers, stills all circulating, all repeating, all insisting that she is present even now. The paradox is striking. The woman who spent her life torn between presence and absence has, in death, become permanently present. And yet, the contradictions remain unresolved. The screen shows her as flawless, devoted, unblemished. History tells us she was scandalous, divided, restless. Which is true? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. For her children, the myth was both comfort and burden. Isabella Rossellini would follow her into the world of cinema and fashion, inheriting not only her mother's beauty, but also the inevitable comparisons. Pia, who had once felt abandoned, learned to carry her mother's absence as a kind of inheritance, a reminder of the wounds fame inflicts on family. All of them understood that they had shared their mother with the world, and that the world would never relinquish her. The motif of mirrors, so constant in Ingrid's life, lingers beyond her death. Each generation looks into her face and sees something different. The wartime angel of Casablanca, the scandalous lover of Rossellini, the resilient survivor of Anastasia, the weary but unbroken woman of a woman called Golda. Each reflection is true, and each incomplete. She was not one face, but many, layered like transparencies, overlapping but never merging. In a way, her death on her birthday is the final mirror, a perfect symmetry that reflects itself endlessly, an eerie reminder that beginnings and endings are not opposites but twins. To be born and to die on the same date is to be sealed, to become story rather than flesh. It is as though fate itself pressed her life into a cinematic frame, looping from the first scene to the last, with no fade-out in between. Philosophers often speak of fame as a form of haunting, that celebrities do not die, but linger as echoes, as shadows projected on screens long after their voices have faded. Ingrid Bergman embodies this haunting more than most. She is still here, in the flicker of a projector, in the soft glow of a television screen at midnight, in the eyes of someone who first sees Casablanca and feels that same aching pull of longing. She has become both presence and absence, incarnate alive in image, absent in flesh. What remains is not an answer, but a question. Who was she truly? The saint of the screen? The exile in Rome? The absent mother? The unyielding fighter? Or the woman who, on her 67th birthday, slipped away as though her life were never meant to exceed its own circle? Perhaps the truth lies not in choosing, but in accepting that she was all of these contradictions, bound together by a gaze that still pierces across decades. The Reign of London ceased that morning in 1982, but the echo of it lingers in her story, like a curtain falling at the end of a play. Ingrid Bergman's life was not neat, not pure, not free of scandal or sorrow, but in its fullness, in its beauty and its fractures, it remains one of cinema's most haunting narratives. She is the face that remains, endlessly reflected, endlessly reinterpreted. A story that does not end, even when the circle has closed.